There. Okay. Sachi Bogi Juje Meto Tan Re Ram Ling Jin Yin Ne Yen Ba Dia Song Ye Jing Du Me Da Wa Gi Yo Du Gu Nang Da Jing La Shu Ba Shu Yi Dong Guru Rana Ma Da La Gam Ne Ya Ta Ya Mi Song Ye Ju Dong Zu Gi Ju Nam La Ja Ju Ba Du Da Ni Ga Zu Ji Da Gi Ju She Ge Be Su Nang Gi Do La Ben Je Song Ye Du Ba Shu Sangye chedan soge jonam la janju badu dani gazu je dagi je chege besu nangi dola benje sangye duba shu. Sangye chedan soge jonam la janju badu dani gazu je dagi je chege besu nangi dola benje sangye duba shu. So we're entering the last 10 verses of this text. We've been going over this for a long time. And so be thinking about what sutra stuff you'd like to hear next, because we're going to quickly reach the end of it, I think. Um, we left off at a very interesting place, and I'm just going to um, talk about the two verses we went over before to bring you back up to speed and where were in the last class. We went over verse 48. One asked, well, actually, I'll go back to verse 47 to give you a bigger view of it. That reality habit is the cause of all views. That habit is at an unconscious or even conscious level. Our minds tend to impute a self-existing quality into objects of perception, both internal and external objects of perception. And that's the taking what we perceive as being real from their own side and self-existent. It's the cause of all views. Without it, addictions do not develop. So that's the assertion here by Nagarjuna. So when its falsity is fully understood, views and addictions are fully cured. And I'll take you back to the image that the Buddha had an artist paint for a king. If I can get to it without another screen coming up, there it is. um, at the very hub of the wheel of existence is a pig, and that pig is out of his mouth comes a rooster and a snake. And these are considered in Buddhism the three poisons that drive cyclic existence and suffering. That pig represents primordial ignorance. There are two levels of it. At one level, um, that pig represents, here's the first link of cyclic existence, a blind man with a staff. So it's that ignorance of vidya, not knowing what causes what, not really knowing where we came from or where we're going, right? Stumbling through existence. That cane represents that wrong view and that ignorance is basically fragile because it's not the reality, it's not the nature of reality. And just like somebody who depends on a cane will fall if you knock away the cane, similarly, if you can develop the wisdom that can see past the misnotions about reality, that ignorance too and the afflictions that adhere to it will disappear. So that's the whole path of wisdom. How do you see through that primordial ignorance? So at one level, it's not knowing cause and effect, not knowing karma and how karma works. At a deeper level, that pig of avidya, of ignorance, marikpa in Tibetan, that pig is when we cling to our five aggregates in our 12 ayatanas and our 18 dhatus of experience as if they constitute a self. Um, Buddha said the greatest conceit is to think, I am. And so when we really, who here, and maybe one of you is a Mahasiddha, I don't know, but who here had complete control over how your features look and how your body turned out and how your mind works, um, how it developed, right?
If only.
What? If only.
I said, if
Yeah,
only.
I
Yeah,
wouldn't
we
have planned it exactly like this.
exactly. We are what we are because causes and conditions have produced us and brought us to this point, and they're constantly changing who we are. And at some point, when those causes and conditions cease, so does this illusion of a self that we cling to and that we hold to so dearly. So, so anyway, that's what the Buddha is talking about. That ignorance from which desire and hate and all the afflictions come, that is what drives all the different links of dependent origination from ignorance to karma to the consciousness that carries the karma to the name and form of a future life to the sense powers to contact between sense powers and objects and consciousness to feeling to craving, initial desire, and then strong craving, to becoming, and then to birth. And when there's birth, inevitably there's death. And so that cycle is all in the jaws of death, and its origin is that ignorance, that primordial ignorance. We have learned ignorance, and we have primordial ignorance or natural ignorance. So anyway, that's what Nagarjuna is saying. When you see through the falsity of what ignorance perceives or holds to, that's when the addictions, the afflictions of mind are completely cured. There's nowhere for them to hold. And he's going to go more deeply into this before he ends his treatise. So one asks, how can this be understood? It is understood by seeing relativity. As I've said before, this translator takes the word tendril Tendang or Juma, and they translate it as relativity, which I think is a mistranslation. I think it should more realistically be translated as dependent origination. That's more accurate, and it includes relativity. The dependently created is uncreated. Thus spoke the supreme knower of reality. And that's kind of where we were leaving off because it's very hard to wrap your head around. In fact, as I've said many times during this class, it is only the Prasanjika Madhyamaka level of Buddhist philosophy that I think has an accurate um, presentation of this point. All the schools below it either err on being a little bit too much towards impute, imputing true existence or a little bit on the nihilistic side, depending on how they're interpreted. Um, and then, of course, schools outside the Buddhist system seem way off from a consequentialist Madhyamaka point of view. Um, so the dependently created is uncreated. Um, I heard of a friend of mine was at a retreat at kind of a Buddhist center that was known for doing creative stuff. And so during their break time between meditation sessions, they put on a play based on the Heart Sutra. These two actors came on stage and said, "Ain't no thing." That's how they start. Ain't no thing. Um, I think one of them said, I heard a righteous dude say, ain't no thing. That's how they put it. So this is getting to that point in the Heart Sutra. When you first read the Heart Sutra, many people get confused. Um, there's no form, no no feeling, no concepts, no volitions, no consciousness, and it goes through this list of different factors of reality, know this, know that. And so a lot of people, when they read that the first time, they fall into nihilism. So is Buddha saying nothing exists? Which is, that's one extreme that Buddha is not teaching. And I've heard even quite good scholars make this error. They purport themselves to be Buddhist scholars, and they even teach at universities, and they'll talk about Nagarjuna being nihilistic. And I'm like, no, no, you completely missed his point, right? Um, but that's one extreme. Nihilism is very destructive because if your mind falls into nihilistic ideas, you miss the import of cause and effect and how karma works. And you can end up completely getting off the path and having no way forward. On the other extreme, eternalism, um, in Tibetan, these terms are cheta, which is nihilism, and dakta, which is eternalism. In the eternalistic extreme, you start to impute a self where there's really no self nature. And that's what's being talked about here. When that happens, like when you think there's this real me, then you start to get protective and you cling to it. And then something threatens it, you get afraid or you get angry, right? And then all the different afflictions arise out of that imputation of a real me here in these khandhas, right? So that's the eternalism extreme. And that's what's being refuted by Nagarjuna when he says the dependently created is uncreated. And I use the example, which is taken from Chantakirti's commentary, that if you take a lamp in the old days, we used to have a lamp where there'd be a wick and there'd be some oil and then a glass around the flame to preserve the
Okay.
flame, right? And so when you look at that combination of factors that's needed to produce a lamp, what you start to realize if you really investigate it is there's nothing there that has the essential nature of being a lamp. It's a combination of different ingredients. When they're all put together in the right way, they have the capacity to produce a flame that's steady, which produces light. But there's no essential nature in any of those ingredients that is the lamp. Before you put all those pieces together, there's no lamp there. Even when you've put all those pieces together and they're functioning, you can't say that there's an inherent thing, a substantial thing that's always been a lamp, always will be, or has been a lamp, right? It only suits that label lamp as long as those ingredients are there. Once those ingredients fall apart or aren't there, you can't label them a lamp um, correctly from a relative point of view. But the essential nature was never there. It was dependently originated, and it was never inherently there anywhere along that step. It was merely labeled once the proper pieces were put together, right? It was merely labeled and imputed by mind to be a lamp. So to us, we're in the same condition. Somebody, when we were born, labeled us Wilson or David or Bobby or, you know, whatever name we were given, right? Maybe later in life we got another name based on what we became, right? Like if you become a nun, you become a venerable or Anila in Tibetan, right? And so those names are imputed based on that dependent origination coming together. So it takes a while to think about that, but you have to admit it's true. Um, and so Nagarjuna is right on, he's right on target. He's not exaggerating. He's not minimizing. He's talking about reality just as it is. So then the last verse we went over in the last class, those overwhelmed by mistaken knowledge or trapped by attachment um, in a process of obsession and conflict, clutching to truth in the intrinsically untrue. So that's where we are. That's where we got to. And I mentioned a verse that came from the Buddha himself about the verse we just went over. I'll just read you the verse in Tibetan and then talk about what it means. Kanshi Kienle Kepe Dema Ke. And this is what was quoted in verse 48. The dependently created is uncreated. De la, from that, Kiepe, being born, Rang Xin Yu, a nature that truly exists, Ma Kie, does not arise. So something that arises from conditions does not arise, is how that can be translated. But Buddha doesn't stop there. In this verse, he goes a little further. Tela about that. Kewe Rangshin Yuma Yin. Um, Something that has the nature of being a produced thing does not exist. Now, he's not saying, and this is where fall into nihilism if you don't read it the correct way. He's not saying that its relative nature does not relatively exist. He's saying that there's no ultimate nature to it that you can arrive at if you analyze it. There's nothing inherently there from its own side, not depending on something else. Genla rakle, that which depends on conditions. Yeah, Anila, go ahead.
By relative nature, what do you mean? You mean relative in terms of you need something else to validate it or impute it?
Relative nature is a way to translate the term kunzob dempa. Kunzob dempa, um, kunzob really means thoroughly obscured, thoroughly obscured. And depa means true, that it's something that's true. However, they qualify it as thoroughly obscured. And that gets into what's called the doctrine of the two truths. So this is, and Madhyamaka Prasanchika agrees that there are kind of these two realities with any existent thing. There's its relative or obscured nature, which is when you look at me on this Zoom call and you think, oh, there's Wilson, right? You don't think about it a whole lot, but there's Wilson yapping away, and he's got the shrine behind him. And if you just leave it at that level, you could say it's true in a relative way. There's me talking away, right? And I see you where you are and with your backgrounds that you've chosen, right? And we could all kind of agree that here we are, and we're all on this little screen. However, if you start to analyze it further than that relative sense, then where really is this thing called Wilson, right? If you take apart the form, you know, there are meditations where um, you actually think of the different parts of your body and then you mentally dissect it and think of, the brains over here, the heart's over here, the intestines over here, the skeleton over here, the hair over here, the skin, or where is the being, and that, you know, and of course we would say, well, they're deceased, they're gone, right? There's really nothing there that you could say that is the ex Wilson, right? But that's when we're imputing Wilson onto the form heap, onto the biology that constitutes the skanda of form that got labeled Wilson at birth, but has been changing ever since and continues to change based on causes and conditions. And that's not even getting into Wilson's mind, right? And so when you start to analyze it, um, you say, where is that self that's called Wilson? If it's self-existent, if it exists inherently from its own side, it's got to either be a single thing or it's got to be multiple things. There's no other choice. It's got to be a single thing or it's got to be a multiple thing, right? But if you start to say, oh, it's a single thing, then you do that mental dissection and you say, okay, where is it? Where's this single thing that you're going to call Wilson? And there's nothing there. And same with the mind. Oh, it's not Wilson's body, it's Wilson's mind. That's the self. Well, which part of the mind are we talking? Wilson's feelings of pleasure, pain, and difference, or Wilson's concepts, or Wilson's volitional impulses, or Wilson's awareness of sight, or sound, smell, taste, touch, mental awareness? Which part of mental awareness is Wilson? And of course, as you start dissecting like that, there's nowhere in there that you can find a single thing, an integrated single thing that's called Wilson. So then if you say, well, Wilson is multiple things, then you fall into kind of an abyss of there's really not a single inherent thing that's Wilson, right? So that's illogical too. So if you say Wilson's something apart from his body and mind, then if you take the body and mind and you lay them out, there should be a third thing there that you could point to and say that's Wilson. And of course, there's not. So what we could say, and this is what Madhyamaka comes to, Prasajika Madhyamaka, you could say there's a real relative thing there that we label Wilson, but it's merely labeled. It doesn't exist beyond that. It exists in a relative way as a label that's designating a collection of causes and conditions, right? And then we can relatively say there's Wilson with accuracy. So that's relative truth. That's Kunzal Dempa. And it's called obscured because normally when we go through our days, we just take things at face value and we don't analyze them like that. We just say, oh, there's Ani Kruna, there's David, there's Bobby, right? Or whoever, right? We don't really think about it. But when we analyze it deeply, we'll see that there's no nature to it. And that's its absolute nature. That's called Dundam Dempa, ultimate truth.
There we go.
So what do you call our regular, you just call it grasping at an inherent existence, like our regular way? Because, obviously it's wrong, but what do they call that in Tibetan? Or what do you call it? Like it's
There's
not relative truth because we don't do it properly.
Well, this question is a very good one, but it's a little bit like asking an Eskimo what's the name for snow. And I have like 20 or 30 names for snow. And same when you get into the philosophical schools of Madhyamaka. There are many different labels they have for the misapprehension of reality.
Oh, so this would be the miss. Okay, we'll
Yeah,
just call it
that's
that.
just, it's
Okay,
one
thank you.
term. It's
Okay,
one.
thank you.
Um, that gets into the subjective distortion. Um, these are all really crucial points. In when we perceive something, there's Yul Chen, which is um, the part of the subjective experience of what we're perceiving, right? And then there's the object that's being perceived by that subjective experience. When the sense of self nature is imputed on the object, the Tibetan word is sung. That's called holding the object as if it's a self, as if it has self nature. If it's the subjective part that we're thinking has a self nature, then that's called Zimba, the holder, thinking the holder has self nature. And so there are a lot of terms like that that you learn philosophically. But anyway, but the more
Thank
you,
you very much. Thank you.
or the more you study it, the more you get a sense of it. So I was talking about this verse that the Buddha wrote about, that's quoted in verse 48. Um, so the third line of that, Kienla, conditions, two conditions, Rakle, depending on condition, Gangde, whatever it is that depends on conditions, Tongpa is empty. She, I say it's empty. Anything that depends on causes and conditions is empty of any real nature, any self nature. Yeah,
It,
Sharon.
is that the ultimate truth, what you're talking about right there? That
Yeah.
everything is so that would be the ultimate truth. I mean, that's where we want to get and be.
Well, that's where the closer your mind gets to perceiving it or understanding it, the more liberated your mind will be. Because when your mind is deceived by the appearances and imputes self-nature into them, then the mind starts thinking of me and mine. This is mine, it's not yours, and it gets conflictual. And so that's what's said in the verse 49. It leads to conflict and afflictions, um, obsession and conflict,
Th-
attachment, all
Is that
those,
duality too?
and duality, that's part of
Okay.
it. A sense
Mhm.
of a real me and a real thing, right? That exists from its own side, right? All that comes from that. And it's a subtle thing. It's a subtle thing. Um, well, let me finish this verse and then I'll come back to that. The last line of this verse, Kangshik, whoever, Tongyi, emptiness, She, understands, whoever knows or understands emptiness, they, that person, Bayu Yin, is cautious. Bayu is cautious, right? And so this is the key point. This is why it's so important not to fall into one of those extremes of things don't exist, so I can do whatever I want with impunity, right? That's nihilism. So dangerous because it's not true. You can't do whatever you want with impunity because the nature of causes is that they will produce effects eventually. Karma is not lost and it grows. So you can't just go shoot some hapless person in Minnesota and expect to get away with it with impunity. At some point, it's going to catch up with you. And that gets into all the sayings about what karma is. um, so, on the other extreme, self-existence, if you hold to self-nature, there can be this pride of, well, I'm an ice agent, so I'm protected, right? That's who I am. I'm protected and I'm represented and I can do what I want because I've got the government at my back, right? And when there's that kind of pride based on a misapprehension of self-existence, you can enter into actions that later will really destroy you, along with others, right? It's destructive to the person who holds that view as well as to the victims that they have. And so those two polar views are both equally destructive because they undermine how things really work. They undermine the understanding of how things really work. Sarmaken Rinpoche once said that for most of us, if a poisonous snake fell into our lap, we would freak out. But for somebody who sees the way things really are, that's not scary. What's scary for someone who dwells in correct view is when the mind goes to an afflicted state or considers doing something that's non-virtuous or harmful. That's scary. And so somebody who's dwelling in correct view is cautious by nature. Um, that view itself makes them more considerate because they see how infallible karma is, that they're not immune, they're not above it, um, and that they therefore are tend to be very ethical and grounded. Um, that said, and I'll go back to the wheel of life because this is an important point. When somebody's wisdom gets to be so clear that they no longer are operating within the sphere of ignorance, the mind becomes liberated. And when it becomes fully liberated, it doesn't have this first link in the dependent arising of karmic formation. For karma to form, it must begin with that ignorance clinging to some self nature. And then from there, you get karmic formation. When the mind becomes completely free from that deceptive view, it becomes truly liberated until whoever holds that state completely transcends samsara. And there's Buddha. Buddha's outside this whole wheel of suffering, and he's pointing to the moon, which represents the path to that cessation of karmic suffering and dependent arising within this wheel of suffering. So ultimately, you can transcend karma by fully developing your wisdom, your insight, until it becomes fully developed. So I hope that makes sense. But meanwhile, we need at least that relative wisdom that sees that causes will definitely give effects because we need that caution to pursue on the path of morality as we pursue the path of meditation, as we pursue wisdom. We need that to hold us and keep us going forward. All right. So that kind of catches us up to where the text is. Do you mind if I go to the Tibetan? I'll come back and forth, but for some of you, I know some of you want to learn the Tibetan as well. Um, Okay, so this is where the Tibetan starts for verse 50. This word is chewe, dagni chende dak. So chewe means great. Dagni means beings. Um, in Sanskrit, dagni, chewe dagni is Mahatma. You've all heard of Mahatma Gandhi, right? It means a great being. Chen means having that kind of fully developed wisdom. Dedak means those who are great beings. And in Buddhism, that refers to beings on the path of seeing and beyond. That's I think Bobby, you were asking about this, like when can I get the direct view of emptiness, right? And I mentioned it's a walk. It's an interesting path. Um, there are five paths mentioned. One's the path of accumulation, then the path of preparation, then the path of seeing, then the path of meditation, and eventually the path of no more learning. And that's a fully enlightened Buddha who doesn't have to train anymore because their mind's fully awakened. Um, but in the path of accumulation, and I'm assuming I may be wrong, but I'm assuming most of us are trying to get to that first path of wisdom, trying to get to the path of accumulation. It's defined when you reach the state, if you're following a lower path in Buddhism, just for your own nirvana, your own peace, it's defined as when you get genuine renunciation. If you're a somebody aspiring to the bodhisattva path, to full enlightenment for the sake of all beings, the entryway to that first path of accumulation is when you develop genuine bodhicitta. Not Most of us have to kind of generate bodhicitta, and it takes effort to get there. But at some point, if you don't give up, it becomes naturally who you are. That you just naturally want to seek enlightenment to help all beings. That's your nature. I think of that poor guy who lost his life yesterday, Alex Preddy. Pred, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but it seems like he was always just a very loving, sweet guy who became a nurse, to help people at the VA who were suffering. And he always wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And so that's kind of a natural, I don't know if he had true bodhicitta or not, but at a relative level, in a worldly way, it appears that he was that kind of person that was predisposed to help people and just naturally help them. His last act was to protect a lady who had been pushed over by the ICE agent. He was trying to protect her, and then he got killed. So, but anyway, so that first path on the path of accumulation, when your bodhicitta becomes genuine, then you start to train your mind on what is wisdom, what's relative truth, what's absolute truth, how does karma work, and you develop a conceptual framework for it, or conceptual, but you also try to perfect your ability to meditate. At some level, at some point, your meditation gets good enough that you get to one pointedness, and your wisdom becomes good enough that you get close to a correct conceptual understanding of what's being talked about. At that point, you enter what's called the path of preparation, where your mind's getting ready to move from a conceptual to a non-conceptual understanding of emptiness and how things really are. And there are four levels of that as your mind starts to get more concentrated, more clear, and you start to burn away some of the afflictions that get in the way of a direct perception of emptiness. And then finally, you reach the path of seeing. And that's when the last of the path, four sections of the path of preparation, it's called the peak of existence or the summit. And that's when the mind is fully 100% able to meditate one pointedly on the nature of things, the true reality that things are empty of self nature. It's still conceptual, but the mind has arrived at correct understanding of it and able to focus on it one pointedly. At some point, that goes from a conceptual understanding into a direct realization during meditation, during one pointed concentration, where you see for yourself the emptiness of the self. And there are 16 moments of that. It's a lot of details. But at that point, you burn away completely some of the conceptual misunderstandings about reality, and several afflictions are totally eliminated from your continuum to the point that they can't return. And so your mind becomes elevated to a point it's never been before in the cycle of existence. If you've been following the Bodhisattva path, you're called an Arya Bodhisattva. And that's kind of a great being. It's kind of a great being to meet an Arya Bodhisattva. Um, Once you get to that level, you're not going to fall back into lower realms. You're going to get more control over where you take birth to help beings. Several advantages at that point in your spiritual journey. But you start to go through 10 grounds, 10 bhumis, as you continue to repeat that experience of non-contrived direct perception of emptiness during deep meditation. That's called the path of meditation. As you continue to pursue that, different course levels of afflictions get wiped away. And again, when these get wiped away, they're not coming back. They are burnt away from their roots. And you go through 7 levels of that, 7 bhumis or grounds. And at that time, when you reach that seventh bhumi, seventh ground, you finally eliminate ignorance and all the afflictions from their root. And at that time, you truly become a Mahatma in the Buddhist conception of it. That's called a Mahasattva, a great Bodhisattva, because you are equivalent. If you had gone just the path of trying to get your own nirvana, you would be equivalent to what's called a foe destroyer, an arhat at that level. But you'd be much greater because you've taken the path of liberating all beings. And so you become a truly great being. And then at that point, there are what are called 3 pure grounds that you have to traverse to eliminate obstacles to omniscience and to knowledge. And when you reach the 10th ground, then as you remove the last obstacle, you become a fully enlightened Buddha. So it's a journey, as I said. But I wanted to give you a context of what's meant here when Nagarjuna is talking about those great beings. Um, so you get a sense of it. Namla, to them, jok me. Jok means sided, me means unsighted. So if you think of that unbiased, meaning they don't hold to any side of an argument because they can see that everything is relative. And as people get into disputes about the nature of things, in every case, it's because they're holding to some side of how to view things. And you see that in political debates all the time, right? My side's right, your side's wrong, right? Um, and at a relative level, we could say, yeah, that's true. Some things are just wrong and some things are right, right? But when you reach this level of um, spiritual development, for you, there are no sides because you can see the emptiness of every side. And so you become completely unconflictual. There are stories of the Buddha appearing when there's one story of a hunter coming across a solitary Buddha in the woods and killing him, shooting him with an arrow. And it said that the Buddha just manifested light, rose into the air, smiling at the hunter, and then turned into a rainbow and disappeared. And realized, oh my God, I killed a Buddha, right? And so repented, of course, and but there's a similar story of Milarepa. He was a great yogi who was meditating in the wilderness, and a deer came running through the woods because it was being hunted by a hunter, and it was scared out of its mind. But it saw Milarepa. He was meditating one pointedly, and it was just so peaceful that the deer completely forgot he was being hunted by the hunter, and he just went to Milarepa and he laid down. He was exhausted, and he just went to sleep next to Milarepa. And when the hunter came, he saw that the deer was now looking like it was Milarepa's. It was next to Milarepa, and he got really angered, and he shot an arrow at Milarepa, but Milarepa's power was so great that the arrow deflected and missed him. And then Milarepa was able to teach the hunter, but very lovingly, not at all afraid of dying at that point. So this is really a transcendent state. It's way above where most of us hover in, in our journey. But maybe you're there. Some of you might be there, but I'm not. So it's a very exalted state. Uh, so Chokmei means completely nonpartisan, if you will. Tsupa me means tsupa is arguments and conflict and debate. Me means none, no partisanship, no conflicts. They're beyond it. Um, it's like when His Holiness met Chairman Mao, who was trying to destroy Tibet. They had a very good connection. You know, he was able to really connect with Chairman Mao, and he saw his perspective. When Mao um, was invited to a very sacred um, Tibetan ceremony, there was a part of the ceremony where the Tibetans take some sampa and throw it into the air to the deities. And Chairman Mao took some and threw it to the ground, meaning to all the workers, to the proletariat. And His Holiness understood it. It's like, yeah, he's got a point. So it didn't bother him at all, even though it was somewhat disrespectful to the ceremony. So anyway, at some level, such beings kind of transcend polarization. I know it's hard to imagine, but in our days, but they do. Gangnamla, um, oops, I didn't turn to them. Gangnamla ni jokmepa, who have no position, to them, to those who have no position or bias. Dela to them. Shansho Galaye, for them, how could there be anything or anyone they oppose? So if you're without position and you're dwelling in non-dual ultimate reality, how could you be in opposition to anyone or anything at that point? What do you guys think? It's not that at a relative level, obviously the Buddha said, don't kill, don't lie, don't have sexual misconduct, don't, you know, several different, I mean, how many rules for nuns and how many rules for monks are there and bodhisattvas? At a relative level, of course, there's that sense, here's what's right, here's what's wrong. But in that ultimate sphere of reality, they're not drawn into the conflicts of the world. They've transcended it. So I know this is hard to imagine. Any thoughts on this? I think it's particularly interesting in our time. Yeah, Sharon.
Speaking for myself, I know when I see something and it's not right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
cruel, it's wrong, it's unjust, shouldn't have happened, and um and it's being perpetuated by people who don't really have mores and morals and um good intentions towards others. Um and therein lies the problem for me. Do I do nothing and just say, hey, it's okay because everything's okay? Or do I make choices to affect change that I think would be helpful? So for
Well,
me,
sure.
it, it's a conundrum because I think if you're going to be a great being and you want to help others, I think you need to actually help others.
Mhm.
And I don't just mean by being a great being and generating, I don't know what they generate because I'm not a great being, but um
No.
it- so I'm not there anyway to do that. And so I just see part of my path is helping others, much like that Alex Preety that got killed. You do
Yeah,
what you can to
yeah.
help others. To me, that's my moral compass, but I don't know.
Well,
And
I want to say, I think that's there too. While Nagarjuna is making this point about that ultimate state, um, for instance, there's a great story that you've heard before about a evil king who started destroying Buddhism
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, I remember that story because I use that story in my mind with current events. You know,
well,
we have a bad king. Some people call him president, but oh well. But that's what we have now,
yeah,
running the show. And what Nagarjuna said about, the qualities of a good king and the qualities of a bad king. So I use that regularly.
and so in that story, the Bodhisattva who breaks his retreat and goes and kills the king, um, the sense is he's coming still from this perspective, not with hate in his heart, right? But with that total love and seeing that this needs to be done for the sake of all beings who are suffering, including the king himself, who's creating unbelievably bad karma for his future lives. And
I'm getting close to that. At first, I thought it was apathy, but at this point, you know, um, I don't exactly feel sorry for people that are doing these evil deeds or even applauding them. I mean, some of the stuff I've read for the victim shaming at first took my breath away. It was like, wow, these people did nothing wrong and you're blaming them for them getting killed. It just took my breath away. But after a while, I realized that's their motives and that's their mind. That's not mine. Do you know what I mean? And I don't need to own it. And am I going to change their mind? Well, probably not. But can I affect change in that direction? Well, I can damn well try. I may not be successful, but so it's more like looking at myself, if that makes any sense in the big picture. Where am I and what am I doing? And doesn't make sense.
Well, in the Kala Chakra Tantra, there's a sense that the origins for that tantra, the Buddha met a king of Shambhala, who wanted to become enlightened while still sitting as king. And he asked the Buddha, is there a way to do that? And it said that the Buddha manifested the mandala of Kala Chakra and taught him how to practice it, and that the king became enlightened while still king. And everyone in his kingdom became enlightened. And it said in the story of it that that kingdom of Shambhala still is close to the world, and that there was a um, passing of hats from one king to another, one enlightened king to another, and that in about 500 years or so, the activities of that enlightened kingdom will start to manifest in activities on earth. That's the belief in that Tantra. And it said that one of the last kings who will be a manifestation of the Bodhisattva Manjushri will finally become somewhat wrathful, and that there will be a struggle between good and evil. And in that prediction, the forces of good will prevail against the forces of evil, and the kingdom of Shambhala will be established on earth. And so many Buddhists will pray to be born at that time and finish their path at the time of Shambhala. Very much like the Christian apocalypse and the second coming and heaven on earth, if you read that stuff, very similar. This kind of prediction that came down through the Shambhala tradition. So one very kind of, I would say, controversial lama that many of us have heard of or knew directly was a lama named Trungpa Rinpoche. And he said, it said that he, at one point, he went into kind of an absorption, and he stayed there for like a month or so. And nobody could really reach him. And that when he came out of his absorption, he asked for a pen and paper, and he wrote this beautiful poem down. And the, what he purported was that this was a terma, a treasure text, and it was related to the Kala Chakra Tantra and that establishment of the kingdom of Shambhala in the earth. That was the context. But part of the poem, I'll just quote it to you. I think it applies to our times, seems to me. Um, I'll try to remember it if I can. From the great cosmic mirror, um, wisdom and confusion arose. When the confidence which is primordial was followed and delighted in, a host of heroes arose. When fear and doubt occurred towards that which is primordially free, a host of cowards arose. Those hosts of cowards hid themselves in caves and jungles. They killed their brothers and sisters and ate their flesh. They roiled the river of lust. They flamed the flame of hatred. They wallowed in the mud of laziness. The age of plague and famine arose. Of those who were devoted to the imperial Richten, the enlightened beings, kings, some went to highland mountains and built beautiful castles of crystals. Some went to the pleasant lakes and islands and built beautiful palaces. Some went to the fields and sowed fields of barley, rice, and wheat. They were always without quarrel, ever loving, and very compassionate. At that time, the Rican king sent his messenger as that young warrior. Thus, a good human society was established on earth. So, anyway, it goes on. The poem goes on, but you get the sense of kind of a mythical. Um, and everybody thought Trungpa was the Sakyong warrior who came to establish. So, but the sense in that, that there's definitely a struggle between good and evil. And I've heard it predicted by others in that tradition that the next 300 or 400 years, it's going to be a lot of conflict, but that the forces of good are very mighty and that eventually they'll prevail. So I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but I wanted to tell you that tradition. So,
Well, without the tradition, that is not a hard prediction because of what we have going on now. And, you know, we just have to find ways to almost force guardrails to protect ourselves. I mean, honestly, I mean, people are dying in the street. That's how bad it is. I mean, innocent people. But so that's not hard to predict, but
well, the prediction
honestly, being
was made
70
a
and
long time ago.
having no, being 70 and having grown up here, and even with the Vietnam War and the protests and the 4 students that got killed, there's something about this era that feels so different. It just really does, you know.
Well, that's the other thing that that particular Lama said in his commentary to his poem. He said that a lot of challenges are coming, and it's up to us to make sure that we get through them in a positive way. You can never give up. It's up to each of us. And he talked about the kind of these, he called them lords of materialism. And in one way, there's a psychological meaning of that, but also an outer sense of it too. That these lords of materialism were going to show up and kind of destroy humanity, and that um, people of conscience would have to prevail and stand up to it. And I think that we're in one of those ages now. Again, these predictions came like 50 years ago, but here
But
we
but
go.
but it's true. They want Greenland so the tech bros can fire rockets and build data centers with no regulations, not like here. And, just take resources from other countries. Why? Because we can, and which is not right. That's not fair trade. I mean, what is that? Do you know what I mean? That's just greed.
Well,
So,
the other part of that is when he defined what demarcated a coward versus what demarcated a warrior in his language. He described warriors as people who are constantly moving outside of the cocoon of their own selfishness, motivated by compassion, trying to help. And he defined cowards as people constantly trying to cocoon and grab their territory and selfishly amass whatever they could because they're so
I can see what they're doing in a way. They're trying to feel safe. I know
yeah.
that's what they're trying to do, but it really isn't safe. That's, I mean, a profound reality as far as I can see.
Well, that
Nobody's
that's if you think about it, that's really what Nagarjuna is pointing out, that tendency to cocoon and try to be safe by getting selfish, and then you get into attachment and anger and territory. All of that, in fact, is unsafe because it creates karma that's going to throw you into the worst states of existence again and again. And so when I think when somebody sees that clearly, like somebody on the path of a bodhisattva, that at some point, instead of hating people who are like that, I think what happens is their compassion becomes very intense. And the way that they manifest that compassion depends on what's needed. Sometimes it might be a harsh instruction to that person or a wrathful stopping of what they're doing, but the motivation isn't hate. That's the key. If
Well, actually, and because of what I did or do or try to do, I, it has tamed some of those impulses in me. Like, what the hell are you doing? No, I don't go there anymore. So I can be much more analytical about it and know what they're about. Do I agree with them? Of course not. But and sometimes you really just have to cut somebody off. Like my boundary, I've told the person, hey, I get your opinion. Obviously, I do not agree with you, but hey, you go on and have a nice day. I just set the boundary up because I'm not going to change their mind, but I'm not going to argue with them about it. Do you know what I mean? What's the point?
Yeah, and that's wisdom. In a way, that's the function of wisdom. Can I help this deluded individual who's creating harm for themselves and others? Or do I need to walk away? Or if I do intervene, what's the best way to intervene? But again, if you're living in that place of compassionate wisdom, you're not thrown off course, no matter what.
No, because there was a girl who came up a couple of years ago, and so she was younger, number one, and just got out of school. And so she went to a private school, I'm guessing probably Catholic, because that's a lot of the private schools around here. Not all, a lot of them are religious, so I know that, or Presbyterian. And she just came up and said, I think it would be better if we just burn the whole thing down. And so I was like, oh my God, what a point of view. And so I stayed calm and I just said to her, okay, could you tell me what that would accomplish? It was an honest question. No, I meant it. I wanted to know what her thoughts were. And she thought about it and she goes, I don't know. And then I think she had that realization, like, maybe I'm angry. Do you know what I mean? Like, did that make sense? And she walked off, but she kept coming back to talk to me. It was the wildest thing. And so finally, this last year, she came up and said, about our table. This is all important. I really realized how important. So we went from anarchist to, wow, this is all important. And she explained to me how, what her parents were like, what kind of school she went to, how they treated people who were liberal or right, left leaning terribly, and they were all viewed as less than, and she just realized she had been in a bubble, and she woke up. And so I'm so glad I was patient with her because I planted a tiny tiny little seed that came to fruition. So there are people, I just want you to, that are worth doing that to, and then there are others you just know it's
I,
gonna go
I
nowhere.
think I think that one example really illustrates what Nagarjuna is saying here when he talks about the Mahatmas being without
Right.
polarization and without conflict. What you did is you offered her spaciousness and you heard her and took her where she was.
I really sensed she needed somebody to talk to, even if she was coming off angry, even if it was the opposite of what I believed. And she needed kindness. I knew she needed all of that. So I gave it to her, and didn't get angry.
And I think that's a perfect illustration of what Nagarjuna is getting at here. That's how Mahatmas are.
And I would like to say that I'm always like that, but I'm not. So,
There's the challenge, how to get like that. It said that the Buddha has equanimity, whether somebody's anointing him with precious oils on one side of his body, whether they're hacking away with a knife on the other side of his body, that they would have equanimity and love equally for both of those beings. It's a hard state to get to.
It is, and that's why my very first way I start out the day is my personalized compassion, practice. So I can generate, a bit of bliss in my heart that I can, you know, try and give to others. I don't always stay that way, but I try.
So that's where we're all walking the same path. We're trying to get there. And and I think the more we understand wisdom and perfect wisdom, the more that we can stay in that place, no matter what the situation. Buddha was able to maintain it in the path of Bodhisattva, even when a king was had his minions cutting off each finger slowly and each limb. He was able to maintain that wisdom and that love and equanimity. It's one of the stories in the Jataka tales of what he underwent. Um, so we can hope someday. Do you want to do one more
We have
verse?
little bright lights here and there.
Um, all right, I'll try one more verse, and I'll try to get done on time so that we can do this one too. This is verse 51. Um, oh boy. Oh, there's a lot of commentary I'm kind of skipping over, but I'll come back to it next time. Um, but I want to make this point because it kind of highlights what Nagarjuna is getting at. Ganyang means any place. Rungwa means any suitable place. Ne means to stay or abide. Yea, finding that place to abide. And what he's talking about, when the mind fixes on any self-existent object, internal or external, when it's kind of fixed on that object, nay, then Nyumong means afflictions. Trul duk means trul is a snake. Duk means poisonous or venomous snake. Um, when the mind fixes on any place, um, yo chengi, um, the wording here is different than the way. No, it's okay. Um, this is right. Yo chen means writhing. It's describing the snake, the poisonous snake, like writhing, getting ready to attack. Ye by that. Zimba means ensnared. Yura means become. So anytime the mind fixates on some self-existent me or mine thing, the poisonous writhing snake of afflictions will ensnare the mind at that place. Gangi Sem, whose mind, Neme, has no place to abide, one whose mind has no fixation, is aware that everything is dependent origin and therefore is empty of any self nature, that kind of person, Dadak, those people, Zinmigur, do not become entrapped, do not become ensnared. So that's like the key point. When you can dwell and abide in that wisdom, realizing everything dependently arisen is void of self nature, the snake of the afflictions has nowhere to sneak up and take hold of you. Otherwise, what happens, and I don't know if this was true of you, But when I watch the news and some horror happens, I get so mad, you know, and I'm kind of there and get more and more stuck on it. And I really have to work at getting unensnared. It's not that I don't come back to what's right and wrong and take a stand, but my first step is always I try to get my compassion back and my composure and my insight. I try. I'm not always successful, right? But I,
But that's hard to do. I mean, because to me, part of it is wanting to see reality, this love-hate relationship I have with, even if it's really bad, I want to know. I need to know. And then some of it's so outrageous. Yeah, I do get angry. I get angry, I get hurt. I think about all the people that got affected by, one person's death or family and, so on, our society. But I try to come back and I will turn it off so I can reflect, not just immerse myself in it and like become it, I don't want to become that.
and I think that's what Nagarjuna is recommending. I'm Nagarjuna well knew that that's what our minds do, right? He was able to describe it so poetically, right? So I hope that'll be our quest until the next time that we meet up and talk about it. For instance, the horror that was perpetrated yesterday and continues to be perpetrated. So many causes and conditions have led to this point in time, from history, really bad actors in charge of media, greedy, so many different,
Money, so much money from just a few people.
yeah, greed, narcissism, you name it. So lots of causes. All those who perpetrated are also victims of their own afflictions while they're afflicting everybody around them. But if you can come back to compassion and wisdom, then you're going to be able to keep your path good for you and good for whoever encounters you. That's all Nagarjuna is saying. You can follow a path of compassion and insight and be even more effective in how you intervene with the world. That's my thought on it. So, good discussion. Thank you, Sharon. It's really useful because those are the times we're
Oh,
in.
if you can't apply it, then I don't know what good it is. That's how
Well,
I
we're
look at
trying.
things.
We're trying. We can only do the best we can, right? Each at their own level, whatever's going on. Sashi Bogi Jojin Medo Tan Rira Jin Yinde Gemba Dia Sange Chindu Mede Wagi Dogu Nanda Jinga Juba Jo Idon Guru Ratna Mandala Kamneya Dayami Gewadi Gewo Kun Sunam Yeje Zozo Jin Sunam Yeje Lejun Wen Dambo Goni Dobasho 上周三九人不歇，马也把那个月节，也把娘把没把养，国内共度百万说，干日让为可爱性感的，本当的我马路中为呢，前日子往电增加所以，下半时的把都 thank you 去。I
Oh,
often think of His Holiness and how he's done such a perfect job managing to deal with the secular world while not straying from the spiritual path. He's such a great example of this, with what happened to Tibet and how he handled it and how he. So we got lots of good examples, but yeah, it's
oh,
challenging.
I was hoping for if you were looking for other texts to
Oh,
do
yeah,
next.
yeah.
Can I like Arya Deva's 100 Verses or the other two Nagarjuna, the Precious Garland or the Letter to a Friend? I mean,
Okay.
just three thoughts. I mean, it's up to you because you know what you know. So,
Right. If could I ask, would you email me those titles? And if anybody else has a title that you want to hear, and then I can look at what I've had commentaries to and what's available, and then we can continue on. Does that sound okay?
Yes, thank you. Sorry to
Those are
interrupt.
all great. I like all of those texts. Those are really wonderful. Okay. All right, everybody stay safe, and I'll
Thank
see you
you.
next time, okay?
Bye,
Thank
Wilson.
you
Bye,
for
Thank you.
everybody.
teaching. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Take care.
Bye.